Hang on to your ass. Segaiden is about to enter the danger zone.
This is going to be the part where you all sing the opening theme to my show.
Sega ruled the arcades in the mid-'80s with their amazing superscalar games, and they did their level best to bring those games as faithfully to Master System as possible. But when it came to the amazing, mind-blowing Afterburner, they might have overreached a bit.
But first, it's worth noting that the Master System conversion of Afterburner brings the budding Nintendo-Sega rivalry full circle, in a way. Sega clearly created Afterburner in the image of 1986's hit flick Top Gun, or at least as much as made sense for an arcade game. I mean, it completely lacks the romantic tension between the film's leading man and lady, portrayed on screen by Tom Cruise and Kelly McGillis. Which is fine. The idea of Tom Cruise being earnestly attracted to another human being has always been a hard sell for Hollywood. Must be all those unpurged body thetans. It also omits the movie's overarching theme of Cruise's character living up to his call sign, Maverick. There's probably an interesting game to be found in that storyline, but Atari explored that concept the same year, albeit with cops, in APB. So Sega decided just to focus on the parts of the movie that involved F-14 Tomcat jets flying around looking cool. This is in no way a direct recreation of the film, of course. Afterburner involves a plane with infinite bullets and missiles that blast an incalculable number of enemy fighters out of the sky. Said fighters resemble a sort of hybrid of Soviet MiG-21s and Harriers. If at any point in history an American plane had knocked this many presumably Russian jets out of the sky, that would be the end of history, because those air skirmishes would be a side story to a nuclear exchange that wiped out humanity. But hey, creative license. Anyway, it's not as though the tentative Soviets here don't give as good as they get. Afterburner is, in true Sega style, a crazy hard game, a relentless quarter gobbler. I don't know that it necessarily comes by that difficulty fairly exactly, but it certainly comes by it in the most exciting fashion possible. In arcades, Afterburner ran on an evolved version of the boards that powered Hang-On and OutRun. Called the X board, it could display twice as many sprites at once as the System 16 and OutRun boards, all at a slick 60 frames per second. Afterburner took full advantage of those technical capabilities by not only pushing as many objects around the screen as it could possibly manage, but also by untethering the action from the ground, and in fact from the limitations of gravity. As thrilling as the company's earlier superscalar creations had been, Afterburner took it to the next step. It was the realization of Yu Suzuki's ambitions for a Space Harrier, a fact hinted at by the vestigial mention of Harrier in that game's title, which is to say a rail shooter that allowed for free movement in all directions. But the power of the X-board means that the player doesn't have to race a few feet above the ground while in flight. Rather, this is true aerial combat. Your Tomcat doesn't simply flit around on screen while maintaining a rigid orientation relative to the point of view in the ground. The fighter plane here banks and climbs, jukes to either side, and performs evasive rolls. And when you roll, everything rolls. Your plane remains relatively fixed to the screen, but the horizon spins with dizzying speed to convey the sensation of a pilot performing a barrel roll. At the same time, the world around your plane rushes past at hundreds of miles per hour. High-altitude stages scale thickets of clouds into your viewpoint, simulating the act of breaking through the cloud barrier. Low-altitude maneuvers force you to skim the ground as you blast past surface details and avoid dangerous rock outcroppings and other hazards. Meanwhile, enemy planes approach from both fore and aft, daring you to lock onto them and take them down while loosing missile after missile in your direction. And when you do unleash a missile of your own, its contrail fills your view and spirals away as it hunts down its target. And all the while, the force feedback controller buckles and twitches in your grip, creating a powerful physical sensation of turbulence, a feeling amplified for those lucky enough to experience the game's sit-down cabinet. It's all very impressive and exciting, but the sheer amount of stuff happening on screen at any given time, the hundreds of sprites defining the world, all rapidly changing size to indicate their spatial relationship to the player's perspective, results in an incredibly cluttered window into the world. The missiles do their Itano circus thing as the clouds fly into your line of sight, all working together to obscure your view of your plane, of the enemy, and most of all, of the enemy's attacks. The average Afterburner session for a new player works out to about 30 seconds, as incoming missiles knock you out of the sky sight unseen. Afterburner looks incredible, but the action tends to boil down to performing evasive maneuvers and hoping for the best while trying to fire back at whatever enemy planes happen to cross your line of sight. That didn't stop Afterburner from being a massive hit, of course. Easily one of the top coin-op games of 1987, simultaneously capturing a certain zeitgeist while presenting players with a wild, if somewhat unbalanced, white-knuckle experience like nothing else in arcades at the time. However, it does make for a somewhat disappointing Master System conversion. The Master System has to date done a pretty good job of providing an approximation of superscalar experiences on vastly weaker hardware, at least when Sega has made the effort anyway. Here though, the upgrade to the more powerful X board simply creates too immense a gulf in capabilities for the Master System to compensate for. To its credit, Afterburner on Master System looks as good as any home port you could possibly have imagined on any contemporary home hardware available in the US in 1988, save for the Amiga. And it does capture the essence of the action, if not its visceral thrills, without being quite as blotchy looking as Space Harrier's background tile tricks. Still, a conversion of Afterburner that plays faithfully to the arcade game but loses its visual panache can't help but be a bit of a letdown. Strip away the graphical thrills and you end up with a fairly shallow experience. Like the arcade game, Afterburner on Master System largely comes down to evading enemies and making furtive strikes whenever possible. But the game's shallowness is laid bare here by the fact that you can literally just fly into a corner and safely avoid any possible enemy attacks for the first 12 of 18 stages. That's not a particularly fun way to play, admittedly enough, but you can do it. And if you don't take that shortcut, the game usually ends up being just as short as the coin-op version for largely similar reasons. The high speed and visual overlap, not to mention the frequent detailed dropout resulting from the game's reliance on rendering interactive elements with background tiles rather than sprites, makes for a cluttered, confusing game. Sega did at least have the mercy to program in a couple of continue codes that players can input to allow them to keep the action going once they go down in flames too many times. Although this info doesn't appear in-game or even in the manual, it showed up fairly soon in game magazines and tip books, meaning that anyone who picked up Afterburner around the time of its launch had plenty of time to practice and get good enough that the continue codes had the potential to put them over the edge and allow them to see the ending, maybe. It goes without saying that Afterburner is one of those Master System games that faced direct competition from a recent at the time release for NES. In this case, it had to stand up against Konami's take on Afterburner's direct inspiration, Top Gun. In that light, Afterburner seems downright miraculous. Top Gun wasn't bad, but it was more of a low-key flight sim that just happened to involve a lot of shooting at enemies. Top Gun also forced you to deal with somewhat realistic landings on aircraft carriers, whereas the carrier here, USS Sega Enterprise, a famous nuclear vessel stationed near Sega Alameda, only exists as eye candy in Afterburner. And unlike in Top Gun, you probably won't experience a game over if you bungle the refueling sequence, if only because you probably won't survive long enough to run out of gas. Afterburner has a more focused creative vision than Top Gun on NES, with 18 stages of pure action across a wide variety of environments, versus 4 stages of multi-phase combat and simulation, and it looks a whole lot more impressive, roughly approximating the gyrating horizon line of the arcade game, as well as many of its giant chunky sprites. All of this is to say that Afterburner on Master System offered a good enough rendition of the arcade game for the time, though it's one that's aged poorly. That's in large part due to the fact that stripping away the visual thrills of the coin-op reveals the fundamental flatness of the underlying game experience. It turns out this Emperor has no flight suit.
In the harshest place on Earth, video games find a way. Our penguin pal, Commander Overbite, has somehow escaped the harsh confines of the SG-1000 and rolled his eggy babies over to the comforting bosom of the Master System.
This, the second entry in the Doki Doki Penguin Land trilogy, holds a couple of unusual distinctions that you might not expect from such a fairly modest-looking puzzle platformer. For starters, Penguin Land for Master System was the only entry in the series ever to reach the US, the SG-1000 original remaining in Japan for obvious reasons, and both the Game Boy port and Mega Drive sequel failing to leave Japan because... well, honestly, I don't know. Maybe the Master System release just bombed super hard in the States. This despite the fact that it holds the distinction of supposedly being the first ever console game to ship with a lithium battery that retains data in memory. Now, the first battery backup games I'm aware of shipped on Epoch Super Cassette Vision, but those involved your standard NiCad AA's, and the player had to provide those little guys on their own, plugging them into the cartridge. Penguin Land included a lithium-ion battery secured safely inside the cartridge, where it could provide a steady, low-voltage charge capable of preventing a tiny cache of volatile memory from being wiped when the system powers off. Of course, diehard gamers who owned both an NES and Master System would already have been familiar with this concept, as The Legend of Zelda had shipped in August of the previous year with its own battery, giving Nintendo a nearly half-year head start on Sega's innovation. Except that in Japan, Penguin Land also shipped in August 1987, August 18th to be specific. That places it 4 days ahead of the official American launch date of The Legend of Zelda, which Nintendo provides as August 22nd. Did Sega actually beat Nintendo to the lithium battery punch? Could be. But then again, American NES release dates were anything but a firm science in 1987, even for a game as significant as Zelda. As I've noted before, games tended to show up at retail haphazardly. Whenever a given retailer received a shipment, and the manager decided to put it out on the floor for sale. Personally speaking, I ended up playing Ninja Gaiden long before any of my friends, because my aunt worked at the warehouse at Best Products and grabbed a copy for me the day that it came off the truck, weeks before it showed up on shelves. And I got to use her 20% employee discount too. Not that it matters at all. Even if copies of Zelda showed up in stores before Nintendo's canonical date, which is possible, the Japanese and US games markets were totally independent entities, and I guarantee that not a single person on either side of the ocean who didn't work for a games publisher was even aware of the launch of both games in August 1987. But more to the point, neither company ripped off the other. Sega and Nintendo simply arrived at similar technological solutions at the same time. Both companies had published games way back in 1984 that could record game data to tape cassette, and the idea of making that feat possible without relying on a peripheral was inevitable. Anyway, it makes for a pretty amusing contrast. Nintendo gimmicked together a battery-based solution to allow players to record progress in the biggest, most ambitious, open-world action RPG ever seen on a console to that point. Sega bodged together their solution to allow kids to make their own levels in a game about a cartoon penguin rolling an egg to safety. That is to say, Zelda's battery made possible the most forward-thinking adventure ever seen on a console. Penguin Land's battery presented a handy solution for a vintage feature, the level editor concept that had been popularized half a decade earlier by the likes of LODE and Pinball Construction Set. In any case, roughly half a dozen Master System games would ship with a battery, including some obvious candidates, Phantasy Star and Ys for example, along with some weirdo surprises, like Monopoly of all damn things. Penguin Land probably didn't need a battery, but it's nice that it included one all the same. Then again, maybe that worked against the game. In early 1988, contemporary publication Computer Entertainer devoted a fair amount of ink to the shifting dollar-yen exchange rate, which had grown seriously unfavorable to Americans following the end of the two currencies' post-World War II coupling in the mid-80s. This affected NES and Master System cartridge prices right around this time. Their respective publishers manufactured those games in Japan and exported them to the US. And the monetary shift caused Sega, in particular, to have to resolicit several games at a higher price than they had originally announced. This hit Penguin Land especially hard, since its price also accounted for the added cost of the battery. A cute little puzzle game about penguins was likely a difficult sell for most American gamer dudes as it was, but a cute little puzzle game about penguins that included a $10 surcharge over similar games from a year before? That's rough. But hey, looks can be deceiving. Penguin Land looks simple and cute, yet it absolutely holds up to its unfortunate premium upcharge. No surprise really, the original Doki Doki Penguin Land may well have been the single best original game for SG-1000, with the most nuanced physics and control mechanics to be found on that platform. The Master System kicks it up a proverbial notch, carrying forward all the original's mechanics while incorporating a handful of new ideas. But let's be clear, Penguin Land is a sequel, not a remake. Despite featuring the same mechanics and wearing the same name, the Master System release brings with it new ideas, new levels, and new challenges. To be precise, Penguin Land contains 50 new stages, not including the ones you design and save to cartridge yourself, and it allows players to jump in and select any of the first 30 levels from the title screen. The core design concept remains unchanged from SG-1000. Your Space Penguin, whose name has inexplicably changed from Adelaide to Commander Overbite in translation, has to roll an egg safely from the surface of the moon to a space penguin living room deep beneath the lunar crust. Space polar bears, space moles, lurk in the lunar substrate, their existence driven entirely by their desire to prevent the safe birth of little space penguin babies. Your eggy efforts involve a few limitations. You need to avoid crushing your egg by landing directly on it, allowing objects to smash it from above or from the side, letting space wildlife smash it, or shattering it by dropping it from too great a height. As in the original, a simple cursor trails along beneath the egg, indicating its maximum safe falling distance. And as in the original, Overbite's surprisingly sophisticated interactions and collisions with the egg make the game merely challenging rather than punishing. Jumping onto your ovular parcel doesn't damage it unless you land on the egg while it's pinned between objects and has nowhere to roll. Otherwise though, overbite's weight simply causes the egg to roll away to a safer space, depending on which side of it you land on. The subtlety of the egg's movements does a lot to elevate Penguin Land above its contemporaries, though the quality of the puzzle designs helps a lot too. Unlike a lot of puzzlers, Penguin Land's stages don't have a single predetermined solution. Although each stage has an optimal route, and certain sequences really demand to be completed a specific way, you have considerable freedom to chart your own route and navigate the game's challenges according to your own best judgment. Given the amount of flexibility you have in your actions, and the way shifting the environment, which is to say breaking blocks, can cause roaming threats like the polar space bears to alter their behavior and paths, it seems like it would have been next to impossible for Sega to have designed Penguin Land around rigid solutions anyway. And that's before you add in the new elements that you have to navigate here. Penguin Land for Master System includes new chutes that only Overbite can fall through, similar to the egg chutes from the first game, which also show up here. You also have to account for cracked ice blocks, which will shatter when the egg lands on them. Although this doesn't affect the egg itself, assuming it falls from a safe height, it forces you to be mindful of what lies below the cracked blocks. If the egg breaks a block and ends up falling again from too high, that's a wipeout. It's a fun, interesting, challenging game. It looks simple, sure, and it probably cost a little more than the market would bear at the time, but it holds up better than a whole lot of other 8-bit games. As for Sega Challenge, Sega didn't even try to sell American audiences on Penguin Land. The best the game got was a single little coming soon screenshot. Shameful. Afterburner, on the other hand, netted itself the cover feature for the second issue of Sega's in-house magazine. This amounted to a 2-page spread that outlined the basic game mechanics with the breathless pose of a chronic marketer. Nothing especially useful, but the screenshots certainly made it look hell hot. Afterburner continued to resurface in Sega Challenge and Team Sega, with tips appearing in issues 3, 4, and 6, and nearly every issue including a cutout form for ordering Afterburner merch. The game also served as the basis of a score challenge in the third issue, with top marks improbably going to an 8-year-old from Kansas who somehow scored twice as many points as the next closest competitor. Must have been that all-corn diet.
Next time on Segaiden, aliens? In my syndrome? It's more likely than you think.